Welcome. Thanks for joining us at this quite early session. I'm assuming everyone was out last night, so you're all laughing. So and including us probably. So I've got a really exciting panel and hopefully a little bit of a sort of provocative discussion. Algorithms and discovery, are bots the next content creators? We're hoping to explore and discuss the impact of the ever-increasing reliance on data. So not only for discovery and curation for audiences, but also commissioning and for those of you actually creating the content. And I think particularly relevant at a time where we're increasingly using social to discover and view content. So firstly, I'm going to introduce you to our panellists. We've got Max, who is executive editor at BBC Three, previously head of development advice, where you also directed the critically acclaimed film Chemsex. We've got a little reel, and then you can talk a little bit more about your role at BBC Three. Congratulations, what a great reel. Would you just explain a little bit about your role at BBC Three?
Yeah, so I'm exec editor, so I kind of work on the channel, and I came in about 6 months before we launched online, so kind of helped devise the strategy for launch and have been there since. And one of the things that we did quite early on is we built an in-house production team and a team of producers, directors, writers, social media practitioners. So I kind of run that in-house team and mainly look after short-form programming. So that span, and my role spans social analytics, the editorial content we do, and then output and content. And as BBC Three, we obviously commission both long form and short form, both in-house at the BBC and from indies as well.
Great. And so now I'll introduce Alex, who is executive editor at Littledot Studios. Prior to that, he was at Maverick, where you worked across some pretty big multi-award-winning, multi-platform shows like Embarrassing Bodies online, and I think you've got a reel as well.
Yeah, it's a clip from one of our Real Stories original films. That was a clip from one of our original commissions for Real Stories. But just to dial back a bit, because I'm aware that unlike BBC and BBC Three, some of you, probably maybe most of you, won't know what Real Stories is. So to briefly explain, Real Stories is a channel that is run from Littledot Studios, who are a digital broadcaster and producer, and we have a background in IP, in what you might call kind of IP protection. So we started out taking big catalogues of content from distributors and broadcasters and producers and making sure that it wasn't being uploaded onto YouTube principally, but other digital video platforms. And if it was, that it was either being blocked in certain territories where there were deals in place, or the money that was being generated by that advertising revenue was coming to a legitimate source rather than whoever just uploaded the content illegally. And that started 5 years ago. And as a result of that, we amassed an enormous amount of data of what people were watching all over the world. And how long they were watching for, all of the sort of key metrics that you can kind of that can be incredibly useful to get data from, basically. And as a result of that, we realised that documentaries and factual content was super popular online. So that's why we launched Real Stories. And I'm sure we're going to get into more of the nuts and bolts of it. But effectively, the reason why it's sort of relevant to this, I think, panel is because it was an entirely data-driven approach to launching the channel, and that data has now informed the content that we acquire for the channel. And as I'll get into with the clip there, to a certain extent, it's also driven what we are commissioning now for the channel as well.
Brilliant. And then I'm just going to introduce Farida Viz, who is Professor of Digital Media at the Manchester School of Art and Director of Visual Social Media Lab. You have some slides.
I
and then
do.
perhaps you
I
tell us a bit
don't,
more about your
because
role.
I'm academic, I don't have a fancy reel. I have old school slides. So yeah, just to say a little bit about what the Visual Social Media Lab does is we're a group of researchers, both in academia and industry, and what we're trying to understand is essentially the impact of social media image sharing across a number of different areas. So the reason we sort of started this is because people now share billions and billions of images a day. The latest statistics I could find from last year were over 3 billion images. I think this is probably a very low estimate if you think about the numbers of users of different social media platforms. But that's essentially what we're trying to understand. And I guess sort of connecting to some of the examples Alex gave, imagine us on the other side of that conversation where we're trying to understand what are social media users talking about, right? So like the R. Kelly example, this was massive discussion on Twitter. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand what are some really big conversations on social media, but specifically connected to images. And so this is a slide from 2015 where we noticed that the image of Alan Kurdi, which some of you may remember, I'm not going to show you the image, but the dead 3-year-old refugee boy who washed up on the beach in Turkey, generated this massive conversation on Twitter, and there was this huge spike around the day that image was kind of went viral. And the thing we noticed with our commercial partner Pulsar is that the discussion flipped from talking about migrants to talking about refugees. So this is a really, really big social issue that we then became interested in, and we brought 15 different partners to the table, including Google, to try and understand what are people saying about this child, what is it that they're interested in, what are people searching for. So we put different data sets together, Twitter data, but also a very, very large data set from Google to try and have this kind of multi-layered reading of what people were talking about, which could then lead, of course, to documentaries. And so I was involved in a documentary for a Dutch broadcaster, which used our insight from the report and our data to try and understand what was it about this child, what was it about this image. And we are now tracking the kind of the long-term implications of that image. We're also running a number of projects on Instagram, just to give you a flavor. We're looking, for example, at how social is bubbling up new social trends. So we're looking in the food space, food projects with the Food Standard Agency, looking, for example, at the rise of veganism, which is completely linked to Instagram, and also the rise of wellness bloggers. So we're doing a project on Deliciously Ella and trying to understand kind of her multi-platform empire. We're also looking at Donald Trump on Instagram from his very first post with Tiger Woods and trying to understand how is this person evolving through these different eras on Instagram in order to try and understand users in this kind of different timeline approach. We're also running a number of projects with First Draft News, which is a very large project based at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University, looking at verification and working closely with journalists in the mis and disinformation space. And a report that is coming out next month that we've been working on is trying to understand the role of images in mis and disinformation. So we've got a report out soon looking at the UK and French elections from last year and trying to understand, when it came to mis and disinformation, were there images involved? Spoiler alert, yes, always. And what were those images then? Why is it that certain types of images are particularly good for spreading certain types of misleading content? So what we're working with is kind of trying to come up with a typology to better understand different kinds of content in that space. So we're working with First Draft's typology that goes from, saying it's satire, maybe it's memes, to it's completely manufactured imposter content, may come from bots, and so on. And just to give you a final example of an image kind of in that space, this is an image that went viral around the Westminster attacks last year. Who of you have seen this image? I'm familiar with it. Okay, so that's quite a few of you. How many of you knew that it was part of a massive disinformation campaign by the Russians? Okay, no. So what happened was that in March, this went viral, and it got lots and lots and lots of media coverage. It was linked to very negative kind of sentiment around Islam and around Muslims. The woman in the picture was kind of tracked down. Why did you look away? Why did you not stop? And so on. So there's kind of, again, on social media was this massive discussion, but it also went into the mainstream. And it wasn't until November, when the congressional hearings were happening in the US, and both Facebook and Twitter had to hand over lists of known fake accounts and bots and so on, that the account that had been the kind of the super spreader of that image turned out to be a Russian agent. So, you know, in March the image goes viral. It's not until November that we find out it actually was a Russian agent who was also at the time meddling in Brexit and was kind of generating all of this kind of negative sentiment. So these are the things that we're really, really interested in, and I think could very much lead to insight for documentaries. So that's where we come in, I think.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think it shows, really highlights. So first of all, thank you, and it highlights the kind of that's a bit of context into what we'll be talking about. But also it highlights the impact and the power that social media has, I think, on people's worldview. And I suppose with that in mind, Max, BBC Three was the first linear channel in the world, I think, to become a digital-first proposition. So given that you commission across social as well, and I think you're probably the only UK broadcaster that does that for now, and your content goes on iPlayer, social, and also you have linear TXs as well. How does that inform your commissioning process?
Well, we have broadly, we kind of commission 80% of our budget goes on long form, which is primarily for iPlayer, and then it plays on linear. And that's, you know, not changed and has always been the case. And then 20% goes on new forms of content, which includes social first commissions. And I think the reason why we've done that is because, and hopefully it came across a bit in the reel, is that often those social first commissions are either attached to the long form, so it's about a kind of an additional, deeper engagement around something like Killed by My Debt, for instance. So big drama doc. And then how do we try and get an engaged conversation around it? So that's one way. And then we do commission original social first formats, and you know, what we realised very quickly when we launched online is, you know, we have to go where our audiences are, and you know, to be relevant and remain relevant in a very crowded space, and tell stories that matter to young British audiences, we have to disaggregate our content across lots of platforms. Some we own, some we don't.
And Alex, your Real Stories brand is sort of super pertinent to what we're talking about, because that came about really because you saw data, you saw a gap in the market. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you use data to come up with, to inform your entire strategy around that?
Yeah, so as I was sort of saying at the beginning, the channel wouldn't exist without the fact that we had knowledge that I think other people didn't have. No one had been able to kind of, I think, get that much data on a worldwide kind of scale and be able to actually look at it and be able to tell who was watching what content, what genres of content, and, you know, things like, you know, how long they were watching it for. And it kind of cut across quite a lot of perceived wisdom, I think, that was out there, in particularly the distribution industry, which was that people, generally speaking, if you weren't talking about sort of high-end drama or maybe some comedy, that people, you know, factual television kind of had to stay within its kind of national boundaries, because no one in America would be interested in a story set in Britain, or a tiny number of people would, and that's not enough to kind of to form a critical mass of viewers. And you know, there was all sorts of things about things like the age of content as well. So you know, that something that was older than a year or 2 years wasn't relevant anymore, so no one would want to watch it. Well, we had this data from illegal uploads of content that went completely against all of that. We were finding lots of British content was being viewed all over the world, but heavily in North America. And a lot of this content was 5-10 years old. But it was new to them. The audience that were finding it was new to them, and it was still relevant to them. The stories were still relevant to them. So we saw an opportunity there, and then we built the channel, the Real Stories channel, on the basis of what was performing on those illegal uploads. So we went out and we did legitimate deals with distributors and said, can you give us this content, and we will now place it onto our channel, we'll schedule it, we'll optimize it, we'll do all of the right things that we know how to do to make it most appealable to an audience, and we'll start to sort of build a brand up from there. And we started with that 3 years ago, and we're at, as of today, we've got 1.5 million subscribers on YouTube. Most days we'll do anything from 600,000 to 1 million views of the content, and those are long form views, so there's very little short form content actually on our platform. So most of those are 45-minute and 1 hour docs, and we continue to use data to inform all of those decisions. We look at what is performing well, and we look to acquire more of that content. We're not slaves to the data. We still allow ourselves the editorial eye to say that's an interesting piece of content. It's not something that we've got sort of on the channel, or we don't know if it will perform, but we'll give it a go. And then again, as we started to commission original content at the end of last year, the first port of call was what genres have performed well for us on the channel so far, on the acquired content, and then we sort of established some broad buckets, and Adam, who's sitting in the audience here, is a commissioning editor, then went out looking for stories from filmmakers that fitted into those buckets, but also we made some new buckets as well for stuff that we just wanted to kind of try out.
And what sort of frame, when you say you look at what performs well, what does that mean? Are you looking at certain topics, themes? Are they stories that haven't been told before, or are they things that have been told before and you know that they do well, so we're going to serve up more? And when you look at your audience, so just to look at the framework with those buckets, basically, are you looking at like age, demo, where the audience are located?
So and all of those things come into it, and I mean we're unusual for a platform in that so we our demographic split is about 65% of our audience is female. We've got an audience in North America, around about 60% of our total audience is in either the US or Canada. And it's very young, 70% of the audience is under 34. So it cuts against quite a lot of the, considering a lot of the content that we acquire was originally broadcast on a platform or on a channel that might have had the complete polar opposite set of demographics. It might have been male skewing, if it was broadcast on BBC One, as a lot of our content is. I don't know what the latest demographics are from BBC One, but I've got a feeling they're quite, they skew old, and I think they probably skew at least sort of 50-50 male-female.
I think the average viewing age of BBC One is over 60.
Yeah, so yeah, doesn't surprise me.
That's not channel specific, that's kind of across television in the UK.
Exactly. So the interesting thing is content that was perhaps originally commissioned with a different set of people in mind is now actually being taken out there, and when sort of like you remove the kind of sort of the channel aspect of it, as in the original broadcast channel, you suddenly get people discovering content that that they might not have been designed for them. So that's all sort of relevant, and I think in terms of what we consider, metrics, you can look at different metrics in different ways. I mean, what the metrics that matter to us on YouTube are is sort of watch time. So the views are important, but watch time is the most important metric for the YouTube algorithm. And I'm sure we'll get onto the subject of the sort of content discoverability aspect of it as well, because I think that's a really important part of our the challenge that we have as a channel that doesn't have or only has a very small sort of owned and operated kind of ecosystem. We rely on whether it's on YouTube or whether it's on Facebook Watch, we rely on search engines and algorithms to surface our content above other people's content, and we have to be incredibly competitive. And so part of that process is how do you make that content more visible? It's to ensure that it's what people are searching for and what they are looking for, because that will mean if they're already watching something of a similar genre, there's a good chance your film will be served up to them next, or next time they log on to that network, it will be your film that is suggested to them to watch, because they've already watched something similar. So we do definitely look at what is popular and acquire and commission accordingly.
So you've talked there about a data-led sort of editorial, and then you mentioned algorithms, and maybe for your best place,
academic.
I'm going to turn to the academic to say, what is an algorithm and why are they important?
I'm probably not the best place to explain this, but well, I mean, essentially, think of an algorithm as a recipe. So if you think of a computer algorithm, think of it as a recipe that executes the same way every single time. So it produces predictable results. So this works in search. If you're searching for something, think of massive places like Google, YouTube, Amazon. They work on very sophisticated search algorithms, but they also surface content. So they also work in such a way that they surface based on past behavior. And increasingly, they are doing that in almost every aspect of our lives. So we're talking about the entertainment industry here, but this is also true if you want to apply for insurance. This will be a combination of multiple data sets, including increasingly what are you doing on social media in terms of making decisions about whether or not you can be insured or whether or not you have to have a higher premium, for example. And they also surface in very, very problematic ways. So think, for example, in kind of crime statistics, predictive policing. There's a really good book out by Sophia Noble called Algorithms of Oppression, which talks about the relationship between algorithms and race, for example, and the ways in which algorithms are essentially racist. But also in deeply personal ways. For example, I recently, or last summer now, I keep saying recently, had a child, and one of the things that, the algorithm surfaced, the NHS, in my data was that I was apparently too old to have a child at home, and also that I should be induced. And when I questioned the midwife, all she could say was, that's what the algorithm says. And I was like, well, but you're talking to me, and I'm not obese, I don't have high blood pressure, I don't have any of the reasons why this might not be possible. I am going to have this child at home, and I don't really care what the algorithm says. But it's just to say that so many of our social interactions now are run by data sets that are invisible to us, yet in all of these different ways. So this was a very, very deeply personal way, end up shaping our lives.
So, do you use data in the same way, Max, that Alex does when you work at BBC Three? Because presumably, because you've extended your brand onto digital platforms, and of course iPlayer, you probably get much more detailed data than you would from Barb. Does that help inform your decisions? Do you look at what's doing well and do more of that, or do you look at gaps and how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, more and more so now. Data is, a daily kind of, source of information, and helps us adapt, iterate, tweak things in real time. So on our short form and on social, it's absolutely integral to, what we do. And like various tools the BBC has now have really helped us work out, how better to optimize content, what thumbnails to use, what titles to use, which I think from BBC Three moving online, there's amazing skills that have been brought into the BBC actually, and starting to emanate out, which is great, which I think is a good thing and an important thing. And then on iPlayer, now we have signed-in data coming through. It is fascinating and helpful, but it's still nascent, right? So mandatory sign-in only came in, I think, towards the end of last year. So, and the average user of iPlayer only visits iPlayer, I think, once or twice a week. So it's going to take time to get data that meaningfully can help inform our commissioning. But what we see is, thankfully, BBC Three titles are a big pull for infrequent users of iPlayer. So people who don't come often to iPlayer seem to get hooked in by things like Stacey Dooley programs, which have over 60% 16 to 34s consuming Stacey docs, and people just do nothing as well. So those underserved audiences that we are absolutely targeting, that data starts to help inform the sorts of titles that we know resonate with those audiences.
And Alex, would you ever make a decision, if data said no, would you ever make a decision to create a piece of content where all the data said that's just not going to work? Or, yeah.
Yes, is the truth of the matter. I mean, especially the thing is that we're lucky in the sense that I think even it would be the case on BBC Three, even without the pressure of the kind of the 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. slots where it's sort of limited. There's still a lot of pressure on kind of performance of individual titles and stuff. You're still going to be subject to kind of criticism or whatever if you put a lot of money and time into something and it doesn't pay off. And of course that's the case for us too. But because we have two buckets, we have the acquisition side of things, and generally speaking, our business model is based on revenue share. So we very rarely, or not really at all, do we put money up front to acquire content for our channel. So part of the thing is that if we try something out and it doesn't work, all that happens, we've wasted some resource and we've probably got a disappointed client. But what we haven't got is a big loss of kind of financial loss.
Presumably that data is important as well, because now you have data that shows why something doesn't work, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the great thing is that you can then look at that, and the first thing you see is there's always a drop off in the first minute of a piece of content being viewed, always. But that drop off, if it's it can be 20% or 30%, and then the curve evens out, and you've got people staying for the whole time. That's a really good outcome. You will always lose some people at the start for all sorts of reasons, but on some content it will drop. And then it will sort of plateau, and then it will drop again. And by the time you've got 10 minutes in, you've only got 10% of your audience there. Something's wrong. The audience didn't like the film. They didn't like the start of the film, maybe. They didn't like the content or whatever. But you can then look at it and you can say, well, actually, is it the content, or was this just a bad film? Was it something that we shouldn't have acquired? And quite interestingly, one of the things we do, we have a big Facebook presence as well, and on Facebook we can release full-length content, but more often we sort of do editorialized cut downs of longer content. So existing docs are then sort of distilled down into an almost a highlights package. And one of the things that we do a lot is we look at where the viewing spikes are, and in particular, there's an interesting thing through YouTube that you can get, which is people can share a longer piece of content on YouTube, but they can share it with a timestamp on it. So what you get is people sharing a particular moment, saying you've got to watch this, and it's at 3 minutes 72 in the film. 3 minutes 72, that would be a bit weird. 3 minutes 17 in the film, and that then you get that as a piece of data, and you're like, well, that's interesting. Why are they sharing it at 3:17? What you've got there is effectively a crowdsourced kind of
Trailer.
Exactly, yeah. So we then look at that.
Just jump to the good bit? Do they watch the whole thing, or do they just go to that?
Well, I mean, I'm sure some people do just watch that clip, but other people, the idea is just like any sort of bit of promotion. It's hopefully you watch that clip and then you're intrigued and you're hooked, and you then go back to the beginning and watch the whole thing. But then what we will do quite often is we'll make sure that either just that clip or that clip is a big part of something that we create, a bit of editorial cut down that then goes out as a separate asset on Facebook, because the data, the users have already shown us that's interesting. They're choosing that moment and they're sharing it amongst their friends through whatever medium. And so we know then if we actually make that, optimize it, do all the right things with it, and put it out there to a bigger audience, there's a good chance that's going to be very popular on social media.
And is there anything to both of you really that's really surprised you, where it's gone against all the signpostings that this probably wouldn't do that well and it flew, or we thought this was going to do amazingly and it just didn't?
Yes. I mean, I think who would have, but especially with the long form, I don't know any data that could tell us a mockumentary set in the Cotswolds featuring, two young people in the Cotswolds would be the hit it was in this country. So I think you have, editorial hunch is so important. It absolutely is. And there is always commissioning decisions we make on the channel that are just purely because the talent attached is extraordinary. Yeah. The voices are fresh, the territory is different, and you haven't seen it before. And no data could tell us that those shows like Fleabag or This Country, or People Just Do Nothing even, would become the hits that they became.
It's like you've got to create space to be surprised, and that is... So it's a balance, presumably, between knowing what to deliver your audience because that's what they want and that's what the data says, and also taking a few risks and going, well, that's the magic.
Totally, yeah.
And
it's about mix.
There's So there's a lots of limitations to being too data focused, right?
Yes. I mean, the thing with being data focused and data driven, I guess, and Alex essentially sort of picked up on that as well already, is the data is only as good as the questions that you're able to ask it and the insight that you're able to see from it, because most often the data hasn't been created with the purpose of answering the questions that you actually wanted to answer. And we sort of know that, but sometimes I think we forget it because the data can be really compelling and you go on these kind of fishing expeditions to sort of see, interesting things come out. And I think absolutely data can surface insight that is impossible to get in any other way, but it's also really important to not forget the role of the human. So the commissioner and the hunch, the gut feeling, the talent, all of those things will just always be really, really important, I think. And so I think it's a case of having that kind of combination and finding the balance, I suppose, and also thinking about what are the data sets perhaps that could tell you as much as you possibly want to know. So one of the things that we're very, very conscious of in the lab is that data from social media is really interesting and really compelling, and it's not very expensive, but it only tells a very partial story of those users or of those potential audiences. Whereas probably the data that gives you the most insight is extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily slow to produce, right? So it's also a question of where do you put resources, and how do you kind of combine that kind of slow getting of the data with what you get from social in order to then make certain decisions and get that deep social insight.
Also, I think it's really interesting. I think it's like data often will tell you something's working and audiences really want it. So for instance, we do a short form series called Amazing Humans, episode of it about tattoo artists giving free tattoos to people who'd self-harmed as cover-ups and stuff, went absolutely massive. And everything we did around tattoos was massive, huge engagement, massive engaged community. Whenever we did anything about it. Same with vegans now. Like anything we do about vegans, it's huge. But then, you commission, so we commissioned a 6-part series, I see Lizzie here who looked after it, about tattoos, which did really well, and, or you look at more vegan-based content. And by the time...
New phrase, vegan-based content.
Vegan-based content. By the time, but also you have to be aware that they're trends and things move. And like for now, people are interested in tattoos, but then they'll be interested in something else. So it's also about, I think, having your finger, in that really horrible term, having your finger on the pulse a bit and feeling like what's the next thing that people are going to be talking about.
And so on iPlayer, obviously you have control over your platform. It's your platform. But where, Alex, you're working within YouTube, do you ever feel like restricted? Because I read an interesting article in the New York Times recently. They did a lot of analysis, particularly around Trump elections and whether the platform itself was biased. And the article said that you're never quite hardcore enough for the YouTube recommendations algorithm. And so what starts with a video, you start looking at videos on vegetarianism and it takes you to veganism, or jogging takes you to ultramarathons. And Trump rallies will take you to white supremacist or Holocaust denials. And actually extreme content does better because it generates more engagement, good or bad. And so do you find limitations like in the kind of content you create or the audiences you're serving because you're working within that another platform?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I would also just say tattoos, I absolutely agree, because we've just had a massive hit, which is all based around tattoos, and Adam has a very long and illustrious history.
Adam's been doing
tattoos.
Yeah.
How many episodes of tattoo-based content? 50 tattoo films over the things, and they keep on delivering. So long. We really hope that trend continues for a time going, because that's it's really
the new
tattoo. So anyone's got any ideas, because that's been great. But yeah, so I mentioned how we are probably more so, certainly I think, than obviously BBC Three, obviously you're out there on social platforms as well, so you are subject to the same kind of the same issues that we're having on that bit. But you also have your own platform that allows you to kind of sort of control, to a certain extent, what people get presented. Sort of you can curate it a bit more. I mean, we're entirely subject to content discoverability algorithms, and there are ways that you can. We're in a privileged position because the nature of our business has been active on YouTube for 5 years or longer than 5 years. We have there's an enormous cachet that comes with that actually gives you various sort of ticks in that algorithm that means that content that is placed on your platform will appear above that same piece of content uploaded to 99.9% of other channels out there, because with so many, I don't know if it's still the same, but is it 500 hours uploaded every minute to YouTube? It's impossible for it's certainly impossible for humans, but it's actually impossible for an algorithm really to actually know what's good and what's not. That's why there's all these brand safety issues around content. So they have to set rules, and they don't tell people what the rules are. You just have to kind of extrapolate them out from data that you've got. But that allows you to, that means that certain content is promoted above other content on the platform. And yeah, the thing about sort of chasing the sort of more extreme versions of things, I mean, it's kind of interesting because we deal with content which is, it's more similar. For us, we put up a true crime film. The likelihood is that the next film that you'll be served will be another Real Stories true crime film, and then after that it will be another Real Stories true crime film. And one of the sort of frustrations is it's like, we know our audience likes true crime, but I mean, how many people are going to watch 3 true crime films on the the bounce? And these aren't 15-minute or 10-minuters; these are 45-minute, hour ones. So there's a sort of thing that it's like, well, actually, I'd quite like the algorithm to serve that to them next week when they come back to the platform. I'd actually like them to serve something completely different to them, something that might sort of be a different genre or a different thing, because then they might be interested in that. But you don't have any control over it.
You just suggested, but do you not find suggested bounces people on in the way you want?
Well, obviously, because we don't have any control over it editorially, as in the suggested video. You mean the sort of right hand, the kind of
no?
The feed
I
box?
mean, like, you can do suggested within the player, can't you? As in, like, watch next or whatever.
But you don't have any. We have
Annotation.
Yes, sorry, on the M board, of course. Yes, you can, and we do bounce people around. And what's good about that is that that used to be you have to be burnt in. Now it's dynamic, so you can change it. You can have like the latest film that's up on the channel, or yes, there is a control there. But actually, we don't get that much engagement through the end boards. It's actually much more the suggested video, which is on the right-hand tab if you're scrolling through YouTube, or depending on which platform you're on, and that is completely driven by YouTube's algorithm.
Actually, they're really unlikely to serve you something completely different.
Exactly.
Right? They're more likely to serve you more of the same, but maybe a bit.
Exactly. They just want to, extreme or incremental or just similar. They just want to keep you within the. They just want to keep your eyeballs on their platform, so that they can keep serving more ads. And I mean, like, they can say that cynically, but that's how we make our money. So great. That's the point. But
I'm sure Google are very happy too.
Yes. Yeah. But it is frustrating because we would love to be able to better curate that experience for our viewers, because if we could say, look, actually this is how we, after this would be the content that we would like to have in that suggested feed, it would be great. But of course that would completely break the whole kind of YouTube system, which is that all content, in theory, at any point you could be pinged off to a different channel, to a different piece of content that is more relevant or is performing better, and that keeps everyone competitive, and keeps the content quality high. If everyone is just allowed to make their own walled garden, the whole thing would be a mess.
And do you think that extremist or inflammatory content just as better on these platforms? But do you think it's any different from like a Sun headline or a tabloid headline 20 years ago, those kind of stories at the tabloid? I mean, is it just a different platform, or is it the same kind of way we've used to sort of pull people in for years?
No, I think it is different. I think the scale is different. I think the speed is different. I think how we're exposed to things is different. The way in which we are or aren't able to switch off from that content is different. So I definitely think it is different. But in terms of inflammatory content, there's a number of issues. I think there's the issue of I don't know if anybody saw the work that James Bridle did earlier in the year on children's YouTube, and essentially this kind of much bigger question that we haven't addressed yet. When we talk about viewers, who is it a human viewer? So one of the things that he kind of uncovered is he sort of went down the rabbit hole of looking at different genres that were doing really, really well on YouTube for quite young children. So genres that, I'd never heard of, children, young as 5, making millions of dollars opening presents, basically. And how those kinds of very, very popular videos were then feeding kind of algorithmically produced content into like super warped, really, really, really problematic content. Things like Peppa Pig getting kind of butchered at the dentist, and people not being kind of aware that their children were kind of just clicking on the next videos, the next videos, the next videos, and then ending up on these kind of like, Peppa Pig slaughterhouse kind of videos. So there's that side, like who are actually your viewers, and what do you then do with that data that's being generated from something that is very unknown? And then I think that the other issue that emerged earlier in the year with YouTube is that, and exactly like you say, the platform is now so big and the algorithms are so complex that they can't really guarantee what is being served around your content, right? And that came very much to light when big brands were basically complaining that some of the content that was being served as part of their brand was, extremist content. So you have extremist videos, and then, your brand sort of sits alongside that. So there is definitely something going on where algorithms are also getting completely out of control, and the companies are no longer able to actually guarantee anything because it's now so hard to kind of figure out what's going on. And then, kind of to your point, does extremist content do better? One of the things that we've seen on Facebook, for example, is the police brutality videos that go viral, that start to play automatically. So also, what does that mean in terms of the kind of content that gets eyeballs and the kind of profiting that happens from those kinds of pieces of content? And of course, in relation to the kind of mis and disinformation space, these platforms are also making rapid changes. So Facebook is overhauling the newsfeed to no longer serve up particular content as it had done, but to start preferencing content that is coming from kind of friends and family. So there's also the thing around the algorithms, yes, but also very much the companies that are making massive U-turns, and we've seen this happening. And what does that do to the models that are being built now around businesses in terms of going forward?
And that's 2 points that are really relevant, I guess, you guys, is one is building a business on data. How accurate is that data actually? And I read recently something like 30% of views on Facebook are fake, and there's all the news around fake accounts. I mean, sort of building a business or using these channels for audiences, how accurate do you think it is? And
what's interesting about, so we have been, business built on YouTube, but in the last year, Facebook's been a massive focus for us, particularly with the launch of Facebook Watch in the US. We've been putting a lot of time and effort and resource into creating content for Facebook. And I was at a meeting at Facebook on Friday. We had their LA data and sort of analytics team on the kind of their very high-tech conferencing software. It was literally crystal clear. I was just, having tried to develop a show based around Skype for years and years back in my previous job, I was looking at this stuff, I was like, where was this when we were trying to get this away? Because this was amazing. Anyway, I digress. The point was that we were talking to them about how rubbish their data is and their analytics are compared to YouTube. YouTube is, once you get into the API and everything, there is so much data in there, so much data, and there's the appropriate protections as well. You can't get down to the individual, but you can get a lot of very important and granular data, which really helps you inform decisions. Facebook is the polar opposite of that. It's really superficial. You can't split it down into specific enough detail. Our insights are very, very limited. So we feel that on Facebook we are we're blind in comparison to what we are on YouTube. We're just sticking stuff up there and hoping that it performs. And the frustration for us is that what we like to do is we like to look at something, and if it's either done well or if it's done badly, we then dissect it, look at it, and try and change it and iterate for next time. And that's what we do for our clients, and that's how we generate money as a business. to not be able to do that, or not be able to understand why that piece of content is performing well and that piece of content isn't, means that all we can do as a business is to just keep trying different things and just kind of keep throwing stuff up there. And so our volume of material, for example, released on Facebook is way, way higher than it is on YouTube. Not necessarily because we want it to be higher, it's because that's the only way we can seem to get sort of like a consistent enough set of things to stick. And I think that is a bit of a problem. But to your point about the way that Facebook has changed, and especially since Facebook is a different platform to the one of 6 months ago, and if you look at the they say that their sort of ethos is now time well spent, and they are algorithmically following through on that. They are rewarding if your content is searched for, if someone returns to your page, not just your post, but the page that you posted from, if they share any piece of content, because they can tell if you share it through WhatsApp, or you share it through Messenger, or any sort of third party by email, anything, that's just massive ticks, because that's showing sort of a really sort of engaged level of usership, and all of that is prioritized over just raw views. And that's why all of the clickbaity click farms, these massive kind of companies that just built up enormous revenue streams and enormous volumes of material just by reposting material, didn't matter if it was good, bad, whatever. A lot of them have been like, some of them have closed, and some of them have, you look at their views from last month and you look at their views from 8 months ago, and they're doing a tenth. And that's a good thing. Generally.
Yeah, it's looking at the value of that engagement, the views across different platforms as well. I think we always counted like 10 Facebook views equals 1 view on YouTube. You're watching with sound on YouTube. You're watching, the watch time is higher, so you are more engaged in that piece of content. Whereas Facebook, you have sort of 3 seconds, and that counted as a watch.
But watch is obviously helping, that as in Facebook Watch, only in the US obviously at the moment. But that obviously because the longer viewing time in the different contexts, so that's changing a bit as well.
Yeah. And so, given what we talked about around fake views and the kind of the impact these platforms can have on shaping worldviews or manipulating worldviews, how important are these? How much should broadcasters, particularly PSB broadcasters, rely on these platforms as part of their sort of strategy?
Yeah. So I think, look, I mean, if you're personally, I think public service broadcasters have a role and a really important fundamental role to play on social platforms. And if you look at even just BBC News on Facebook having 60 million followers or something like that, I feel good about. I'm thank God BBC News have such a huge presence on the social platforms that people use. I think, as I said before, our job is to get our content out to an audience and to make sure that that content is embodying all of the values of the BBC and of BBC Three in particular. And I think as well, but until who knows what will happen in 5 years, 10 years, and I think that there will be moves to, I think public service broadcasters have to kind of work together in this sense as well, and think about, the products that we own and the platforms that we own. BBC.co.uk is a huge platform for young audiences and audiences in general. BBC News, BBC Homepage, Sport. We have these platforms of scale, and I think the big question for big public service broadcasters like the BBC and others is about how we evolve those platforms and those products to replicate the way in which young audiences are used to experiencing and consuming content.
And I read recently, just particularly relating to BBC Three and All Four, looking at how they can make their content and their platforms on VOD much more personalised, and maybe just having a look at the kind of the big platforms like particularly YouTube's recommendation system and going, well, how can we make that? And do you think there's anything broadcasters should be wary of in terms of it becoming that kind of viewing bubble where you just serve the same content over and over? I mean, have Netflix got it right, do you think?
In terms of personalisation?
Netflix, yeah. We've been chatting.
Yeah. I think personalisation. I think honestly, you hear it all the time. Personalisation is the goal, and it's the end point. And I think I don't personally agree with that. I think personalisation and suggested is important, but there will always be a role for the editor. There will always be a role for the commissioner. There needs to be, and it's important that people don't view in their own echo chambers, and I feel really strongly that we have a role in making sure that we expose audience to different types of content, you know.
I suppose it's also important to consider like the positive. So we talked a little bit about the negative impacts of kind of viewing in a bubble and personalisation and extremist content and being served more and more extremist content, sort of going down that rabbit hole. But there are positive examples of personalisation, I guess, serving audiences better, and the positive roles, the positive impact you talked about earlier on that social media has had. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for us, some of the research we've done, if you think about, I guess, you know, surfacing a social issue that then really started on social and then becomes a public conversation, I think the work that we've done around the refugee crisis is a really, really good example. And what we saw there is that it was really social that brought it to the attention of then the mainstream media and then kind of out. So I think what is very interesting about social is its potential ability to surface things way before anybody realizes, you know, this is, you know, a social trend, or this is an issue. And I think, you know, on the one hand, you have, you know, the vegans on Instagram, but also these massive social issues like the refugee crisis. I think even though, you know, like the underground situation for the refugees may be, you know, as bad as it ever was, it is part of a different conversation now, I think. And so I think that, you know, there is something really, really important and valuable about that. So yeah, I mean, I would say that there are positive signs there, but I think in terms of, you know, like large social change or actually changing anything, you know, it needs to come outside of that bubble, which is why we're interested in trying to understand what have people done next, which is really difficult, you know, to find out about. But we've done focus groups and in-depth interviews with people who said that they saw that image, responded to it, and then particularly were interested in those people who then said that they volunteered on the back of having seen that image. And then, you know, we're trying to kind of keep tracking them, how long did they stay involved. That's really, you know, long-term work, but starts to go towards, you know, like some of the points you made, Max, in terms of, you know, we've had a massive discussion around some of these massive social issues. I mean, I guess from my point, I would be really interested in trying to understand then, what did this change for personal narratives, for example? And I think absolutely it will do, but that's the research that's really, really hard to do. But I think
the data you don't get, right? Because
exactly. But once you bolt onto your amazing data that kind of social research and then combine it, not only I think do you have another, you know, documentary ready made, but also you have genuine evidence that social isn't this kind of, you know, frivolous, trivial thing, but actually it's really shaping and changing people's lives, also really very much for the better.
Yeah.
I think you're right about personalisation being a real buzzword, and perhaps I was thinking about Netflix, and I rarely pick what's served up to me. It's really honestly word of mouth in the office or friends, and they're like, you must check that out. And actually when I go into Netflix, I think we were talking about this earlier, like I'm quite focused and I have 2 things I'm going to check out, and it's because I can't go in and just all of that choice is too much, and you spend so long arguing with your partner about what it is you're going to watch.
I'm also
And like watching, so it's just counterproductive.
I'm always weirdly offended by the percentage. 97% chance you'll like this. No, what do you mean? Like, where does this come from? I want, you know, like it's, yeah.
Is it because you feel judged? Because it's like that's sort of queer eye or something like that coming up? Because that's what my wife sort of has. She's like she gets if she's logged in, suddenly all this stuff comes up and she starts to defend and justify every one of those things in the Suggested Jam like that. And it's like, you can't lie. That's what you've been watching. That's what you've been watching. And that's what they're suggesting to you.
I think it's because they've gone too far in the kind of datafied language of the recommendation. I think if it had more human voice and said, hey, I think you might like this, rather than 97% in green, that means nothing to me, and also I'm offended. But if it said, hey, I think you might like this, then I think that would feel different. So I think it's also very much about how recommendation systems make you feel. And it feels like it's very personal but very distant. And I think if there's a way to bridge that by making it feel more human, I think, but that's, you know, me personally, but I suspect that there will be something in that.
And also just over-reliance on those algorithms in terms of not only for the audience, but also for creating content. I mean, for you guys, what happens if YouTube change their algorithm?
Oh, I mean, it's genuinely the thing that keeps us up at night, because it's not that. I mean, we have a much more diversified business now than, say, we had 2 or 3 years ago. We were on lots of different platforms, and we have some of our own sort of owned and operated systems as well. And so we're not in fear of does our whole business model disappear because of one sort of tweak in some sort of server farm somewhere in, you know, wherever. But, you know, we've had different things. We've had sort of this time last year, or sort of March last year, we had what, you know, it's called the Adpocalypse, which was not an algorithm change, but it was a sudden sort of massive issue around brand safety. This was when the adverts were being served against ISIS recruiting videos and things, and just they basically, their policy was, we're just going to, it's a bit like how you get rid of weeds in the garden, we're just going to put a massive tarpaulin over the whole thing for a month, let everything just settle down, hopefully kill off all the bad stuff as well, and then slowly we'll peel it back and see what's still sort of living under there. And you know, we just saw, you know, there's just hideous graphs that are in our office that are only for our eyes to see, but, you know, just in just like a massive kind of Grand Canyon across not the viewing, but on the monetization. We had a lesser extent, actually, an algorithmic tweak on Facebook, which was we were putting a lot of investment into Facebook, as I said earlier, and at the end of the year, this algorithm change came in, and suddenly videos, you know, we could consistently put up a video, and we couldn't tell whether it would make 10 million views, but we were pretty certain we could get a video up to 1 million views just by it being out there. Suddenly, our reach disappeared. The monetization, because we were in the trial with Facebook, disappeared as well. And, you know, lots and lots of scratching of heads. But the good thing is we're very connected with other industries, with other companies and stuff within the industry. So the good thing was that we knew we weren't alone, and we all kind of talked, and we were like, well, so everyone's seeing this. We talked to Facebook. Obviously, they wouldn't tell us anything, but then, you know, sort of you can tell the data.
Nice about it.
They're really nice about it, yeah. Well, they didn't, because you talk to the UK team and they're like, we have no idea what's going on, because it's happened, yeah.
Oh, shit.
It's like, you know, it's happened in LA. But, you know, like I say, for us, we were just kind of like, okay, well, we're going to have to adapt now. Whereas there were whole businesses where they were utterly dependent on the Facebook algorithm working in a particular way, and they weren't actually creating anything of value. They were just basically feeding that beast. And as soon as that changed, they didn't work. There was you know, a company called Little Things that actually weren't by any means the worst of the lot. We were working with them. They had good original production, but they so much of everything was just focused on the way the algorithm works, and it decimated their business. You know, within a month they were gone. I mean, they're back now in a different form, but. So, yeah, that is a constant worry for us, though actually I think now it would be, especially with YouTube, gone are the days of like kind of massive tweaks, massive changes. It's tweaks that will kind of incrementally, and there's always a positive and a negative. And generally speaking, for us, I think, you know, we're quite lucky because, you know, all of the tweaks and changes seem to be about trying to protect the, you know, brand safety. It's about a length of viewing, all of the things that play to our strengths anyway.
I have to wrap up and then open up for some questions, but I feel like I have a duty to answer the question, are bots the next content curators? And I kind of think they already are, and I think that's really evident. I think broadcasters, traditional broadcasters will move in that way as well in terms of how they apply these kind of recommendations across their catch-ups. So, but there are positives to that, and I think just pulling out from what you guys are talking about, you know, understanding your audiences better to serve them better. And Max, you were talking about opportunity to find new audiences that haven't been served, and I suppose using these social audiences really gives you the opportunity to serve content for like global niches, whereas before you get 5 people in the UK watching it, but actually you can get 1 million worldwide, and that's really exciting, and that's telling stories that haven't been told before to audiences that haven't received sort of content made for them before. You also talked about, you know, the positive impacts that social can have, but of course there is the negatives of viewing in a bubble and just being served. But I think the choice, we have more choice than ever, and I think you made the point when we were talking about this earlier around watching Netflix, that like the onus is on you to pick good stuff to watch, and so I guess we have as much responsibility as the people who are creating the content. God, that's a good point to end on, isn't it? Anyone got any questions?
No, I'm not sure if this is a question or just a massive plug. The Children's Media plug. Children's Media Conference next week. We are going to next month. It's been a long week. We're going to be having a discussion to speak to what you were talking about. There's a big move from DCMS to talk about regulation and how do we possibly protect our children online. I wonder if you could all comment on, I think there's something around the positives of personalisation in that if, as a content maker, I know that the viewer is a child, then there's no danger in that instance because I can take responsibility for my actions. Whereas the negatives are that constantly seeing the same thing. What's my question? I don't know. How do we find out what's next? So what's the next vegan tattooed people? How do we get to that?
I guess that's down to creatives, isn't it? I'm a producer, so I refuse to believe that a robot will ever take my job. So therefore, I'm hugely protective over like the magic that's just in my head.
Yeah.
I don't know, but you know,
That'll be the death of
hopefully
us.
you'll make it, you'll commission it. It'll be world changing, right?
I think actually the point about the kids content thing I think is really, really interesting because we look after a lot of kids content as well, and actually on a producer side, because I still do a bit of production, and the main production that I do is for CBBC, and what staggers me is that how much the time and effort and kind of care that goes into the production of that content, and every conceivable impact on the child is sort of talked through, sometimes at at lengths that will make your sort of eyes bleed. But everything is about kind of making sure that whatever we do here that it is safe and it's fun and all the rest of it. But it's all of that care, and then the channels that my son is watching when he's sort of like on his sort of iPad and stuff, it's just it is UGC stuff, and it is the unboxing, and it is the sort of Thomas the Tank Engine videos that have been made at home, and yes, they're fun or whatever, but no thought has gone into that. No thought has gone into things like imitating behaviour or whether or just whether this is just quality stuff that will actually enrich their mind or whether it will just rot their brain. And yet that is the stuff that is being served up by the YouTube algorithm. And bear in mind, this is using the YouTube Kids app as well. So I'm hoping it's not going to have Pepper having her teeth drilled. But apparently some of that did get into the Kids app as well. Despite all of those safeguards. So yeah, it's a massive issue. I'm never in favour of regulation, generally speaking, for sake. But I do think, having witnessed it myself and being a parent myself, it's one of those things where actually the market will not self-correct here unless it's given some guidelines and rules.
It's interesting you talk about the amount of care that goes into creating the content. So, sorry, not just to make this about me, but at your conference next week, so I've got 2.5-year-old, and we obviously try and regulate content. And so he's allowed like one episode of something in the morning while like I'm trying to get ready before he goes to nursery. But because of the recommendation, like at the end of the episode, it can't just end. He always sees a load, and he's like, I want to watch this one with the cat. I want to watch this one, and that's like super hard. I wish it would just. Can you stop my child, my 2.5-year-old, from binge watching, because it's encouraging that. And then when he does it on YouTube, like we have to watch trucks on YouTube, and then it's like the next one he goes, I want to watch that one. I want to watch that one, and you can't. Like that's really hard.
Designed to do that.
Exactly.
It's assuming that the person watching is a human grown-up who has the ability to go, no, actually, I need to go to work.
Yeah.
Whereas your
Yeah.
child doesn't have
So the content's great, really it is, but the way it's being served is just really quite harmful. Sorry. Any other questions? I have one question. Do you have any examples of something that you like, that if you'd listened to the data you wouldn't have commissioned? Like, is there something that, like a big risk? Like, is there something you were like, oh, I don't know if this is going to do well, but we're going to go for it, and it did very well?
Well, actually, so I mentioned at the start, we've just started commissioning original films. So we commissioned 11 that are actually sort of finished and are going out, and then we've got some more that are kind of starting now. But we commissioned the film that I showed the clip from. That was a brilliant film, and it did really, really well. High viewing numbers, really good. It got sort of national press coverage and stuff. Ticked a lot of boxes for us. But that was pretty low risk because it's a true crime story, and we know true crime does really, really well. The one that's been really unexpected for us is the film that we actually put out last Friday, which is a film called Puro, Thinking the Unthinkable. It's about a very extreme form of OCD. And this was a film that Adam had tried to get made when he was still a commissioner at Channel 4, and for various, he just couldn't get it through the system there, because it's pretty horrific, the kind of subject area. And I was so sceptical when he sort of brought it to the sort of sign-off thing, and I was sort of like, I'm not sure YouTube's going to like it as a kind of subject matter, because you have to talk about some pretty horrible things within it, and I'm not sure our audience necessarily will go for it in terms of a subject. Isn't it a bit niche? And but at the end, he sort of talked me around, and I kind of wanted to be talked around, so it was a good thing. So we did it. We got a brilliant filmmaker who made the film, and what's been amazing is not only has that film performed really, really well, it's done sort of 50,000 views over the last weekend, which is a great opening weekend for us on YouTube. The comments are just, they will reaffirm your faith in humanity, because YouTube comments are infamously hideous and awful and just, idiots. These are not. You read through it and it's just people just saying, oh my God, I thought I was alone. My friend's got this, or my brother's suffering from this, or this helps me really understand my friends who are going through this. And then people sharing it and stuff, and you're just seeing that this whole kind of thing is opening up. And that is incredible. That's probably more valuable to us than any of the sort of views that come with it, just as a piece. And that was something where absolutely the data would not have led us down that route, or there were lots of reasons for us to say no to that. But luckily, we kind of recognised that there was a bigger picture.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes. I was interested, Max, what you said about that you now have sign-in data for iPlayer, and also it just made me think about our discussion around Netflix. Because on the one hand, we're talking about, we are able to very precisely pinpoint things with certain data sets. So there was the example you gave around Facebook, not very good data, YouTube, very, very precise. But what about sign-in data? Because in our household, we have one Netflix account. So, my partner and I both use that. We have, slightly different tastes, but we also have a child now. So now, all of a sudden, why am I watching Curious George? Well, it's not me. So in terms of the iPlayer data, again, presumably that's sort of at household level. So I'm just interested in how precise does that data become in terms of audience understanding if what essentially you have is household level sign-in?
That's a very good question, probably not to be answered directly by me, but I think sign-in
just to throw it out there.
Sign-in is also actually always is only on mobile and desktop and tablet at the moment, so it's not on connected TVs, and perhaps that is why, because they're trying to work out how to get to that point. I think as voice becomes more sophisticated, that could play a big role in terms of in-house viewing, shared viewing. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So all the sign-in data we get is easier to know exactly who's watching when they're watching it on mobile or on desktop.
Yes.
So.
In Netflix, you can set up different accounts.
Yeah.
Who does that? Come on.
I do.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm the only one who's just okay. All right. Well, I'm an interested.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why it's not working for you.
Yeah. All right. On that high note.
So we have one more question. Yeah.
I guess this is more of a philosophical one, but historically it's been commissioners and editors that sort of decided what we were all watching, and now we have the rise of the bots. What will happen in the future, do you think, for subjects that aren't necessarily clickbait, like climate change, migration, when we have to compete with bots?
I'll start. It's something that I ponder as well, because it's a really. I was talking earlier about we were talking earlier about the having to choose to watch something versus being just sort of what we used to do, watch a channel, and when you watched the channel, you didn't necessarily know what you were getting, but you knew that someone had chosen it, someone had scheduled it. There was all this sort of care and attention that had gone into it, whereas now it's something that is slightly opaque and is completely beyond your control. I mean, I would say that channels like our own, and there are plenty of other examples out there, that are not clickbait or don't think of themselves as clickbait certainly, and are putting out their sort of the most popular content on our platform is current affairs, and that's quite heartening because it just kind of sort of means it's people that are looking at stories about migration. And I think the stats that you were referencing in your presentation, which was about sort of changing, people started talking about that one image, and then that sort of like shifted the debate away from migrants to refugees and all the rest of it. So actually, I think this can work positively for those subjects as well, because if they're not well known, you can get a piece of content, whether it's video or image or an article or whatever, that suddenly gets surfaced by these algorithms, and then lots more people see it than if they chose to opt in to see it themselves. So there is a positive side of it as well, which is I think that by forcing people to watch certain things that they weren't expecting, by serving it up to them because other people are engaging with it, you can expose people to subjects that they might not necessarily otherwise be exposed to. Obviously, there's the flip side of that, which is getting the more extreme version of what you're already thinking, which could be a negative thing. But I think there is a positive side to it as well.
I read recently, I think climate change, LGBT issues were amongst the top issues relevant for millennials, and I think that's kind of heartening. So I guess if you know how to surface the content, and as Alex says, cut through the noise, just because a subject's worthy doesn't mean it has to be boring and it won't get surfaced, I hope.
And some of that content can surface in surprising ways. I mean, I still haven't had the stomach to watch it, but there was that viral video of the starving polar bear a few months ago that, that's the kind of stuff that you can't, I think, produce knowingly, but someone captured that. And that, I think, did much more to trigger those debates than any kind of well-orchestrated campaign has done. So I think there's that, on the one hand, negative, but I think on the other hand, as has already been said, it has the potential to surface content that otherwise would never be seen, and that has the potential to trigger those big social discussions and debates, and with different groups as well.
Yeah, I was one of the fastest growing social accounts of the BBC is BBC Earth as well, and it's really clear that there is a real desire and hunger. And obviously, I'm not keep banging my public service broadcaster drum, but it's so long as people are still making the blue planets and commissioning those sorts of series, that data couldn't really tell you that 12 million people would sit down and watch a 92-year-old man talk about the planet. But as long as we keep doing that, I think we'll be all right.
And a lovely point to end on. I just want to thank all my panellists, and thank you to you guys too.
Thank you.
Thanks.